Welcome to The Road. This is a weekly podcast of All Saints Lutheran Church. I'm your host, John Pedersen, and I serve as pastor. Each week, we reflect on faith, life, and navigating the road ahead. The language of journey is common when we think about life. It has its joys and challenges along the way, and we all need a little encouragement and guidance at times to keep us going. There's a word in the Bible, asphalia, which means truth, but it's the same root word we use in English for asphalt, if you can believe that. It's a solid surface that makes travel easier and more assured. And so every week we're going to be exploring elements of faith and life that keep us on the road. Faith isn't about living a perfect life. It's about finding our way, getting through rough spots, but seeking out those great vistas too. You can find my weekly message here, but you'll also find special conversations with guests who have insights on things like wellness, parenting, and living with unique purpose. If you appreciate this podcast, remember to subscribe where possible and share it with a friend. Here's this week's message. So, I want to just begin with a question. What are the dividing lines that you see today? What are the ones that stand out most to you? Chances are that whatever your answer is, this isn't a question you have to think real hard about. Divisions are easy to spot. Race, gender, political ideologies or parties, preferred news or information sources, neighborhoods, careers, education, class, income, and divisions start early in life too, with kids and various cliques, clubs, and clothing. Division in many ways goes to the heart of human brokenness from the very beginning, whether it was the serpent driving a wedge between God, Adam, and Eve, or the rift between their children, Cain and Abel. Where divided loyalties emerge, different versions of truth also seem to emerge. How do you even begin to address this reality that has plagued humanity since the Garden of Eden up until the present? The gospel I just read from John chapter 4 is not only one of the longer passages in our lectionary, but it's the longest recorded conversation that Jesus has with anyone in the Gospels. And Jesus walks straight into some deep-seated divisions between Jews and Samaritans in an attempt to bring healing. Now, you might not catch that if you listen to the story on the surface through modern ears, but if you understand some of the context for this conversation, you can see some of the new meaning that comes from that. As we hear in the story, Jesus is in a Samaritan city. So Samaritans and Jews had lived in neighboring lands and practiced similar religions for generations. The origin of the Samaritan people is still not completely understood and known, but most accounts point to some degree of common Jewish ancestry, but it's also likely that they had mixed with neighboring nations who had adopted some of the Jewish religious practices very similar to the Judaism practiced on Mount Zion, but in a new location, as you may have heard in the story. But this led the Jewish people to see the Samaritans as unclean and unholy. Their animosity toward each other reached its peak about 150 years earlier when a Jewish ruler destroyed the Samaritan capital of Shechem and the Samaritan temple on Mount Gerizim. So this explains some of the hostilities we pick up on in so many of the accounts in the Bible when we hear references to Samaritans, and it kind of helps bring to life passages like the Good Samaritan and why it was such an unusual thing that a Samaritan might help a Jew. So Jesus brings his disciples to this place, Samaria, which in itself is kind of interesting for a rabbi to do. And the first words out of his mouth to the Samaritan woman he encounters by the well are, "Give me a drink." As a modern reader, that might sound a little rude to us. And the fact that he's asking a woman he's never met to immediately serve him may also seem a little offensive on the surface, perhaps. But there's a deeper meaning here. There's more going on behind his request. Drinking out of the cup of a Samaritan was a violation of Jewish law. Samaritans were considered unclean, and touching anything, let alone drinking from the same cup shared by a Samaritan, would make you ritually unclean. Not a small problem for a rabbi and someone who is the Messiah. It was also improper for a man to speak with a woman in public. John reminds us of this when he describes the reaction of the disciples later on in the story. And so in a few words, Jesus has just signaled to this woman that he wants to build a bridge, and he's willing to put aside some of his own customs and laws to do just that. So just stop there for a second. Does that line up with your assumptions about Jesus and the Christian faith? I think often there's an assumption and expectation that Jesus or Christians today care only about religious laws and customs. At least that perhaps is a cultural assumption about Christians. But in so many different encounters, we see Jesus regularly set aside these kinds of laws in order to bring healing, to give and sustain life, and to build relationships with people, to repair the relationship between God and people. After all, this is the original spirit of these laws anyway. So Jesus goes on to talk about the living water he has to offer her in return. It's symbolic of new life. Living water or running water is fresh, it's not stale. And then he asks her to go get her husband. And this is another moment in the story that feels a little awkward. It turns out she's had 5 husbands. Many over the years have interpreted this to be somehow scandalous. But read carefully, and it may not be the kind of judgment here from Jesus that people may assume. It's very possible she had been widowed or abused and left behind by multiple husbands. There's no further explanation because it's not particularly important to the story. In fact, more importantly, the reference to 5 husbands may have a layer of symbolism to it. It goes back to the origins and history of Samaria itself. 2 Kings indicates that after the fall of the northern kingdom of Israel, the king of Assyria brought people in from 5 different foreign regions to occupy their lands. Tradition had it that there were 5 political powers that had ruled Samaria and 5 groups that were rumored to have comprised the early Samaritan people. So perhaps the woman did indeed have 5 literal husbands, but it's also possible that Jesus is making a connection to Samaria's 5 metaphorical husbands that have influenced its history and distinct religious expression. The conversation turns at this point. The woman says she knows that Jesus is a prophet. His insight into her life causes her to see Jesus in a new way. In fact, when she says, "I see that you're a prophet," that's a declaration of faith for the gospel writer John. Why is it that you Jews insist that Jerusalem is the only place of worship, while we Samaritans claim it's here at Mount Gerizim where our ancestors worshipped? For Samaritans and Jews, it was really a core question that separated them. Where is God to be found? Jews believed God was to be found literally in the temple in Jerusalem on Mount Zion. God could be experienced by the priests only in the Holy of Holies, the smallest and innermost room of the temple, which was built to wall people off from that, in a sense to both contain God and to protect people from the powerful presence of God. But the Samaritans constructed their own place of worship on another mountain, and so this woman is really wanting to know, I can see you're a prophet. Maybe you can tell me who's right. And so what does Jesus say in response? The time will come and is here now when God won't be worshipped in either place, but true worshipers will worship God in spirit and in truth. Worship in spirit and truth. Worship isn't about being at the right place, Mount Zion or Mount Gerizim or anywhere else. It's about being real and honest in our relationship with God. The fact that Jesus opens up the topic of her marriages may seem a little uncomfortable, But what he does is open up the chance for a real conversation and relationship with the woman about her life, the good and the painful parts. And so Jesus, who put aside various religious purity laws to build a bridge, has continued to create this meaningful relationship with this woman. He's helped create new categories for faithfulness and worship, not tribal strongholds, but spirit and truth, something that is accessible to anyone if they seek it out and ask for it. And it's a turning point, because the woman says, I know that Messiah is coming, she says. When he comes, he will proclaim all things to us. The Samaritans, like the Jews, anticipated the arrival of a messianic figure called the Taheb. A Samaritan document from the 3rd century BCE says the Taheb will come and reveal the truth. Jesus confirms her hope. I am he, the one speaking to you. And it's at that point that she runs to her village and begins to tell everyone. So it remains a big ask today for any two groups or peoples to come together in any kind of unity. Jesus showed how it's possible to put aside categories and customs that are secondary and identify the most important elements of mutual relationship and respect. I mean, how often today do we solidify our identity and practices around things that aren't central to what it means to be a human and a child of God? Sometimes when we express our own identity, whether that's as Christians, Lutherans, or even more personally in some way, we can do that in a way that isolates us and closes us off from relationships with others. And when that happens across different groups, as it did between the Jews and Samaritans, it can leave walls that are hard to break through. How do you heal that? How do you bring people back together in a way that offers renewed respect for one another, even if it's not complete agreement? I think very often the Christian impulse to share the gospel is viewed badly as an attempt to impose our beliefs on others, and historically that has sometimes been the case. But if we understand our calling correctly, it's really an attempt to build bridges and understand the lives of others. Jesus honored the woman and demonstrated a desire for connection, and then he showed in understanding of the woman's life. And later, when she goes into town to tell everyone about her encounter with Jesus, she says, "He told me everything I had ever done." She feels understood. Jesus has seen her in a way that allows for a common future to emerge. The work of reconciliation requires honoring others and extending relationships across divides that may shock some of our own friends and tribe. Jesus' disciples were astonished that he was talking to the woman alone, and a Samaritan woman on top of that. But this is the Spirit at work. This is the living water. What Jesus taught was not stagnant rules and laws and practices. He introduced the woman and all of us to a living Spirit and living God. For Christians, truth is ultimately not simply words on a page or timeless teachings, although I'll be the first to say many of them are. But ultimately, truth is a way and a life that we have come to know in Jesus. It's an inspired truth that stands above all of us and that frees us to love and to hope. And so may you be known and understood by the living God and come to know the living water offered in grace to you. Amen. That's this week's message. You don't have to navigate the road ahead alone. You can join with others at All Saints. Visit allsaintsmtka.org for more information. Have a great week.